Good evening, everyone. This is Greg Cook and Travis Schulten with the Spokane Walleye Club. This is our second in the series of blade bait seminars. This is Blade Bait Basics. And good evening, and thanks for everyone for attending. As I mentioned, this is the second part of our blade bait series. We had part one that discussed walleye patterns, and we did that at the end of last month. If you haven't seen that video, we have a couple of links here that we are going to include in our comments section. We'll also have those posted once these recordings are made public on Facebook Live and YouTube. What we talked about in our first seminar was where to find walleyes at certain times of the year to optimize catching them on blade baits, because we believe the best way to get confidence in catching walleyes on blade baits is to fish patterns that you can be successful with. Tonight, we're going to back up a little bit and we're going to talk about the basics of blade bait fishing. We're going to talk about how we rig the baits, what kind of equipment we use. We're going to talk about how to present the baits efficiently. And we're also going to talk a little bit about colors and what colors we have found that have been effective at certain times of the year in certain conditions. Who are we? Well, my name is Greg, and Travis is taking comments and responding to them this evening. We're both members of the Spokane Walleye Club. We're both family guys with jobs. We are your basic weekend anglers, but we do have experience fishing several areas in Washington, including Lake Roosevelt, Banks Lake, Rufus Woods, the Snake River, and especially the Spokane Arm. If it's within about 2 hours of Spokane, there's a good chance that we've fished that body of water. So what are blade baits? We went over this in the first seminar, but there are several different places that you can get blade baits. They're quite a common and increasingly popular fishing lure, not only for walleyes, but all kinds of different species of game fish. You can get blade baits at the big box stores like Cabela's and Bass Pro Shops, but here in the Northwest, we can also get a local flavor of blade baits. Norasada Custom Tackle has made blade baits for years and sold them in the inland Northwest. And Travis, Spokane Walleye Club member and commenter this evening, has also started to design and paint his own series of blade baits, which can be purchased online. Talking a little bit about how to rig the blade bait. First of all, let's talk about how we have our reels strung. I like to fish with my main line of fishing braided line. I use 20-pound line, and I attach that to a barrel swivel. That swivel is important in keeping a lot of the line tangling and the blade bait spinning around, causing the line to get a bunch of wind up in it. So that's an important element of rigging the blade bait. The leader is about 2 to 3 feet, and I like to use monofilament, 14-pound. What are the knots that I like to use or prefer to rig this up? We'll zoom into the rig here a little bit. I like to use a Palomar knot to connect my braided line to the barrel swivel. And then I have a lot of confidence and a lot of experience, and I've tied the improved clinch knot for years. And that's my preference for attaching the monofilament or the fluorocarbon from the barrel swivel to the blade bait itself. And my preference is about a 2 to 3 foot leader. And I like to attach that to a lock snap, which is important in that connection to the blade bait. Without that lock snap, if you attempt to tie either braided line or monofilament to this hunk of metal, you're likely going to cause that line to fatigue and eventually break after a few casts. Kind of snap or the kind of barrel swivel that I like to use is a size 5 or 7. That's a pretty small sized swivel, but that's the kind of gear I like to use. I don't like to use big, heavy stuff that's going to clank around or sink and cause bow in the line when I'm fishing blade baits or jigs. I also prefer to use about a size 2 lock snap. That's about, I measured it off, it's about 16 millimeters in length, and you can use that measurement there as a gauge if you're looking to buy these types of items for your terminal tackle. So why do I use braided line for my main line? Well, I have a table here that lists some of the characteristics, the positives and negatives of each type of line type. And for braided line, it is a very low stretch line. Some advertise it even as a no stretch type of fishing line. And that low stretch characteristic adds to the element of sensitivity. Without stretching your line, you're able to feel vibrations. You can feel fish picking up a bait when you may not feel it with a more stretchy line like a monofilament, for example. Braided line also has a smaller diameter compared to monofilament and most fluorocarbon fishing lines. And that allows for the line to cut through the water very effectively without a lot of drag, and that can be very important if you're fishing in a current situation. Braid is also a very smooth casting type of line. A couple of knocks against braided line and why I don't tie braided line all the way down to my blade bait is that it's highly visible compared to other lines, especially fluorocarbon, which has the least visibility of these 3 lines. And braided line is not very good at surviving abrasion. And in a lot of areas that I fish blade baits, I'm fishing on a rubble bottom or a bottom that has boulders or rocks. And it's nice to have a leader that's able to have a little bit more abrasion resistance when you're fishing a blade bait. So I'd say about 90% of the time I'm using a monofilament leader. I like having a bit of stretch to provide a bit of a shock absorber to my blade bait when I'm fishing. I appreciate the sensitivity of braid, but braid can be pretty harsh when you hook into a snag or you're into a decent sized fish. It's nice to have at least a little bit of stretch, 2 to 3 feet worth, to help cushion the blow a little bit. Monofilament has decent abrasion resistance, and there are certain brands of monofilament that are better than others. And monofilament is the least expensive of these 3 fishing lines. It's less visible than braided line, but not as invisible as, say, fluorocarbon, for example. And Travis is a bigger believer in fluorocarbon than I am. I believe he fishes it a little more often, and there are other members of the Walleye Club that are big fans of fluorocarbon. In certain situations, the fluorocarbon leader may provide distinct advantages over monofilament when you're fishing a blade bait. The times that I can think of would be in a clear water situation and a cold water situation where you're fishing a blade bait slower and less aggressively, and a walleye would have more time to examine that bait and possibly distinguish that there is a fishing line attached to it. But in general, most of the year I'm fishing this aggressively, and that blade bait is moving quickly, and I'm not too afraid of a walleye seeing that monofilament line. As far as what kind of fishing rod I prefer to use when I'm fishing a blade bait, I like to have a rod that's about 6.5 to 7 foot in length, and my preference probably is that 6.6. The longer the rod you have, you may be a little bit tempted to move that rod tip a little more often. And most of the time when I'm fishing a blade bait, I need to be reminded to slow it down just a little bit to fish a little less aggressively. So that 6'6" is probably my preference. We're looking at using a medium weight rod. So you're looking at something that can handle somewhere in the 6 to 12 pound line class. Tend to work pretty well from the fishing rods that I've used for blade bait fishing. And another important aspect of the fishing rod you choose is the type of action it has. And for most walleye jigging techniques, you're looking to have a fast action rod or an extra fast rod tip. And by the action, this graphic or illustration here on the right-hand side of the page is going to tell you what kind of action your rod has. Most of the rods are labeled, but a fast action tip on a rod means that most of the bend or give in your rod is going to be in the upper third of the rod in respect to where the tip is. You get to a medium action or a slow action rod, these are going to be more of your trolling style rods that have bend all the way down the length of the rod. Having something with a fast action or an extra fast action really helps increase the sensitivity that you feel, and having that sensitivity or sensation is an important aspect of blade bait fishing because you can really feel the vibration, you can feel the fall of the blade bait as you're letting it and presenting it to the fish. And I believe that fast action is a nice compromise in having good sensitivity, but also having a little bit of softness to that rod. Because if you're fishing with braided line, you'd like to have a little bit of cushion there when a fish makes a big run. So here are our preferences. I listed what I like to use as a fishing rod and what Travis likes to use, and there are some similarities here. I like fishing with the Cabela's Fish Eagle rod. It's not an expensive rod. I think it's about a $60 rod, and it's about 6 foot 6 inches in length. I like the one piece. That one piece, I believe, adds to the sensitivity of that fishing rod. Mine is labeled as a medium action or medium weight, excuse me, and a fast action tip. The type of line I like to use is 20-pound braid. It's Suffix 832, and that's my main line that's spooled onto my reel. I checked my tackle box, and what I have tied up for my leaders right now is 14-pound Berkley Trilene XT. That XT stands for extra tough. It's a little more abrasion resistant, and it's also a stiffer line than some of the monofilaments that are on the market. And that stiffness is something that I'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. It can help to mitigate some of the hook fouling that can accompany blade bait fishing. Travis uses a similar setup. He likes a little bit longer rod. He has a 7-foot Fenwick HMX. I believe that's somewhere about $70 to $80 rod. He likes a medium lightweight. He has a fast action as well. And he uses 20-pound braid for his casting main line. And he fishes Power Pro or Suffix 832. He says whatever he can find on sale is what he buys. And for the monofilament line, he likes 12-pound Maxima monofilament. And occasionally he will use fluorocarbon as well. The spinning reel, there are tons of good spinning reels on the market. I just picked an image of a popular one just to show you some of the aspects of a spinning reel that are valuable to blade bait fishing. I like to use a size 2500, or some manufacturers market that as a size 25, but that's kind of a medium-sized spinning reel. The most important aspect of a spinning reel is to have a very good drag system. When you're fishing a blade bait using a low stretch line, like braided line, you want to make sure that your drag is good, because there will be times when you hook into a decent sized walleye and it'll make a couple runs. You want to be able to have that drag do its job so those treble hooks do not pull out of that fish's mouth. And I get pretty pretty diligent about checking the drag while I'm fishing blade baits, and I'll check my drag several times an hour by pulling on the line and seeing how it comes off the spool. You want, with a medium tug, you want at least a little bit of that drag coming out. You don't want your drag cinched down too tight, or you're going to potentially lose some fish that way. Getting down to the business end of the line, we're going to talk about some of the components of a blade bait. And I hear this question frequently when I've done seminars on blade baits in the past. What's the deal with the 3 holes? And a lot of blade baits have these 3 attachment points to the lure. So we're going to talk about that here. There are a few brands of blade baits that may have only 1 or 2 of these holes, but by and large, the majority of blade bait manufacturers put these 3 in there. A good way to test what that hole is all about is by attaching your line to the blade bait and seeing how that lure suspends without putting it in the water. I just take a look at it. And I tried to mimic what a particular blade bait looks like by these 3 different images here. If you put your line in the first attachment hole, the blade bait sits pretty well balanced. It's still probably going to have a little lean to it downward toward the nose of the bait, because that's where the lead in this blade bait is. The rest of it is just a flat piece of metal. The majority of the weight is toward the head. But by the time you start attaching to the back end of the blade bait, that 3rd hole, the blade bait takes on a much more slanted or vertical stance. And that's because the center of gravity is very much tilted towards the nose of the bait. So that, in one respect, will determine what the action looks like in the water and how that lure is going to behave. There is also a significant impact on how that blade will wobble in the water depending on what hole you attach to. The front hole, you're going to get a tight wobble. You're going to be able to pull it with your rod tip, and you're going to feel a very quick vibration. By the time you attach to the last hole and give that lure a similar tug, you're going to feel a much wider wobble, a bigger thump, a slower vibration. So what kind of applications would be advantage to each one of these attachment points? Well, I'm going to give it a go and see if we can explain where the advantages would be. I would say about 80% of the time I am using the front hole as the attachment point. And I feel the most comfortable with that attachment point when I am casting the lure away from the boat, letting it sink all the way down to the bottom. You can tell when that blade bait hits the bottom because you will see your line take a little jump, and then you'll see a little bit of slack build up in the line after you've casted it. Then you retrieve that blade bait with a series of rips and drops with an occasional bottom contact. And most of my rips are anywhere from 12 to maybe 18 inches high, maybe a little less when you're fishing in colder water like we have this time of year. But I like the casting and ripping technique with the front hole. I feel I have more control over it. It's better balanced, and as you're bringing it back to the boat, it tends not to foul up a whole lot. And the casting applications that I like with blade bait fishing are casting in current seams, fishing on the tops of flats, the tops of points and humps. And generally, when I'm casting my blade bait, I'm in depths of 35 feet or less. And there are some more examples of how I cast when I fish blade baits in our first seminar. When I switch to the middle hole, this is probably 20% of the time when I'm fishing blade baits, is when I'm vertical jigging. And it's a similar type of cadence. Occasionally, I will change it up a little bit with a double rip, where I'm letting the blade bait down from the boat, and I'm fishing almost vertically under me. And so I'll pull that blade bait up. I'll rip it a good 12 to 18 inches up. Occasionally, I'll go with the double rip before the blade bait can make contact with the bottom again. And that type of cadence can be highly effective in certain situations. I like vertical jigging when I'm using my blade bait in deeper water, generally 35 feet or more. When I'm fishing steep breaks, I like to use the boat to control where I am along that break, and sometimes I will slowly troll along the edge of a break and present my blade bait vertically. I'll use a vertical jigging technique on the tips of points, and this is a fairly common pattern that we have on Lake Roosevelt and in some of the other bodies of water that I fish in the late summer into the fall, where tips of points and humps out in deep water can hold concentrations of walleyes. And vertical jigging can be a good way to go on windy days. Casting blade baits into the wind can be a nightmare. If these baits catch the wind in just the wrong way, they flutter around like a helicopter, and they can really add a lot of line twist to your casting pretty quickly. So fishing vertically on windy days and allowing the boat to either drift with the wind or some kind of controlled drift can be an effective way to vertically jig and catch walleyes. Now, the last hole, or the third hole, I'm going to have to admit, I have never really fished the third hole on the blade bait. So I had to do a little research before I did this presentation tonight to see what other people do to use this last hole. And a couple of different professional anglers like to talk about attachment to the third hole and using a blade bait pretty much the same way you would use a crankbait. You attach it to the third hole, and you're either slow trolling this bait or making casts, letting the bait sink all the way to the bottom and slowly retrieving it. And that third attachment point gives that blade bait a very wide and slow wobble and can be supposedly effective when fishing flats and other areas that aren't too snaggy. So I'm going to have to give this a try, and maybe if we do some seminars in the future, I can elaborate on this technique a little bit. There are also some other aspects that can distinguish some brands of blade baits from the others, and this is the split ring element. Some blade bait manufacturers will put their hooks on split rings, while other manufacturers will use a split shank unsoldered treble hook to attach to the bait. So manufacturers like Cabela's and Bass Pro, they use these split rings. Some of our local manufacturers like Norisata and Fisherman's Foundry, that's Travis's company, prefer to use the split shank hook. And talk about what I think one of the main advantages of going with the split shank hook, and I have a diagram of what that split shank hook looks like. I stuck a chopstick in one of these split shank hooks to show you how it's not welded to the other two shanks, and that is where you put or are able to attach the blade bait to, is through that split in the shank there. And one of the reasons I like having the split shank hook rather than the split rings is there are just fewer moving parts on the bait. The hooks don't wobble quite as freely with the unsoldered hook, the split shank hook. They don't flap around quite as much as the split rings do. And I think that's an advantage mainly for when you're casting this bait or letting it flutter to the bottom. That little bit less movement, the fewer moving parts, I think you end up having fewer issues with fouling the line in the hooks. And I have a couple of examples of how those hooks can foul up. And fishing blade baits, this is just part of the deal when you're fishing a bait like this. Occasionally you're going to have this happen, but sometimes you get the line stuck on the hook, or sometimes it's a little bit more rare. You get the hook to wrap around the head. And when you're fishing with braided line and a good quality rod, you can tell within a couple of rips of the blade bait whether or not you have your fouled up hook, because instead of having that nice tight wobble, you get kind of this rolling sensation, or the bait kind of throbs in a different weird way. And that's when it's time to just reel the thing up, get it fixed, and make another cast. There are a couple of other strategies that I've found that can be effective in minimizing the amount of times your hooks foul up in blade baits, and that's listed here in the bullet points on the slide. It's the first thing I think that really helps is make shorter casts. These blade baits will cast a mile, but the further you cast them, the higher you cast them, the more apt you are to get enough slack in the line when that bait is in the air, or when the bait immediately hits the water, that you may end up having that hook foul up. I try to avoid casting these into the wind, because that's when you get that thing to flutter around and you get some slack in the line, and you can have it get all fouled up. And another trick that I've tried, and I think works to a certain degree, is when you cast, as soon as that bait hits the water, I close the bail on my reel immediately to try and minimize the amount of line, excess line that's going out from the cast. And vertical jigging, you can occasionally have these blade baits foul up on you too. I've tried to limit how quickly my bait free falls when I'm letting it out in a vertical jig presentation. I just slow the bait descent down a little bit, pump the brakes a little bit so that it's falling in a little bit more controlled fashion until it hits the bottom, and then I'll start my jigging routine. It takes a couple extra seconds to get your bait down to the bottom, but that's time well spent if you don't have to reel it immediately back up because it's fouled up. I'm going to try to explain a little bit more about how to work this bait when you're casting or jigging, and the concept of a controlled drop, because I think this is an important aspect of not only keeping the bait from fouling up, but it's also a great way to be able to feel the bite of the walleye, because most of the bites occur when that blade bait is fluttering to the bottom. And that flutter is really a key because it mimics an injured or dying bait fish. And that's just a trigger for this reaction style bait. So the rip is pretty obvious. And a lot of times I'm ripping, a foot or two off the bottom. But allowing that blade bait to flutter down with as much flutter as possible is a real key to this presentation. But I don't give unlimited slack when it's falling down. I like to be able to feel that bait coming down to a certain degree. And this takes a little practice to do, but that's what I mean by a controlled drop. I'm not letting this bait just free fall, because you're going to miss the sensation of some of these bites, and you're also going to potentially cause that blade bait to foul up a little bit more. I'd say a lot of the bites, actually the majority of times a walleye strikes, you don't know it until you start to rip the bait back up, and you'll notice that all of a sudden there's just weight there. And that's when you finish the rip with a good strong hook set, drive those hooks home, and gently play that fish to the boat. Let's see if I can get this video to work. I wanted to show this video to you to kind of describe the sensation of what a walleye bite feels like on a blade bait. And this is not a blade bait. This is an ice fishing lure through the ice, but I think it does a good job of showing how a walleye often approaches a lure and why sometimes you don't feel the bite of a blade bait, because when this walleye attacks this lure, he's going to hit it and he's going to go up a few inches and just stop. And that's where the hook set happens. So a lot of times you'll feel that subtle little thump, and then there's weight there, and that's when it's time to set that hook and drive it home. Okay, so we talked about how to rig this lure, how to present it, and even a little bit about some of the hardware that distinguishes some blade baits from another. Let's talk about fishing and the color aspect of selecting blade baits for certain situations. I'm going to have to be truthful to you. There are some days where I don't think color matters a whole lot. Blade baits are reaction baits. They put off a lot of vibration and noise. And that is the key component for walleyes biting this bait, is that they really react to the vibration, the sudden changes in movement, and the flutter. But there are times when I really believe that color matters, especially when the fish are slowing down and are lethargic. So before we get into color selection, let's talk about a fish's sense of sight, in particular a walleye's. A walleye's eye looks a lot like a cat's eye if you hit it with light in a certain angle. And that's really true, that a walleye's eye is built a lot like a cat's. And they're a nocturnal predator, and they can see and distinguish silhouettes and things much better in darkness or low light conditions than most any other fish or prey fish that swims. There's also a lot of biological studies out there that suggest that walleyes can distinguish the colors of orange and green, and they can determine those colors the best. It's not that they can't see other colors, it's just that orange and green are much more obvious to them than other colors. And I'm not saying that other colors like blues and purples, browns, and other colors don't catch walleyes, because they do. I catch fish on all kinds of colors all the time. But I do have a lot of orange and a lot of green in my tackle box, because walleyes can really key on these colors. Let's talk a little bit about the science of how light behaves in water and how different wavelengths move through the water. And this is a couple of illustrations that I've taken from a couple of different sources that talk about the science of fishing. The image on the left is assuming a clear water situation, and it shows how different wavelengths or different colors behave differently and penetrate light differently as they go down in the water. And this image is trying to show us that elements of red, those wider or longer wavelengths, don't penetrate light as efficiently as greens and blues and some shades of purples, the shorter wavelength lights. So the image on the right is an attempt to show what those different colors look like as you get deeper in the water. So reds and oranges lose their characteristic hues faster than yellows and greens do. So by the time you're in 25 or 30 feet of water, that red blade bait that you're looking at on the bottom of your boat is not going to look red anymore. It's going to look maroon or even brown. Similar story with that orange blade bait you have. It's going to start to look brown, and you're going to have a tough time determining in 30 feet of water depth the difference between a red bait, an orange bait, or a brown bait. You compare that to greens and chartreuses, those colors will hold their color distinctions a lot better in deeper water. And there are a lot of other variables too, besides what walleyes can see and the depth of water. We're also looking at elements of water clarity, wind, a windy day with waves versus a flat, calm day, a sunny day versus a cloudy day, and even the sun angle from high noon to sunset, or a sunny day in June is going to be different than a sunny day in December, for instance. So I look at all of these different elements and scratch my head, and it makes my brain hurt. Well, what color should I really choose to help me catch fish? And I think the answer is just keep trying lots of different colors until you find something that they're keying in on. So I did a couple of things for this seminar. I first rummaged through my tackle box, and I picked, by my memory, patterns that work in certain situations and scenarios. And then I took pictures of them, and I was going to talk about it a little bit. And then I also dug through all of the pictures on my phone where I had pictures of walleyes with blade baits in their mouths to see if it fit my preconceived conception of what kind of colors work the best. So for a stained water or a low light situation, and by stained water, I'm talking about the spring runoff, times like from February all the way through April or even May, when we're moving a lot of water through the system. That's when our water here in Northeast Washington is often stained the most. And in these stained water or low light situations, I really like dark colors. Dark colors stand out better than light colors by and large in a dark water situation. So blacks, browns, and anything with black stripes, those black stripes will really pop in a stained water environment. There are also certain shades of chartreuse that will stand out better than other colors in a dark water environment. So here are a couple of examples of blade baits that I would feel confidence in fishing in a stained water or environment or right as the sun is setting. Here are some examples of a bright sunny day with clear water. On these days, I really like flashy baits. Those flashy baits will really stand out and push light around and call walleyes in from a considerable distance. So I like the chromes, the copper-plated baits. Travis with Fisherman's Foundry does an excellent copper-plated bait that I've caught a lot of fish on. It's one of the best producers on Lake Roosevelt in clear water environments, especially when it's bright outside. I will occasionally use blade baits with prism tape. Prism tape is another great way to throw flash in the water of different colors. And white is also a great color to use on bright sunny days. That white will stand out, and there are a lot of bait fish species that have at least some element of white to them. When the water is lightly stained and you have some clouds and some sunshine, this is often a time when I'm fishing in maybe shallower water. Current seams in April, May, and June. This is a pattern where a lot of times I'll be fishing in 20 to 25 feet of water or so. And I really like having realistic color patterns when the water has a bit of stain to it, but still fish can distinguish what a bait looks like. It's not just a silhouette moving around. So I like golds, especially browns and greens, patterns that have scales on them, stripes. This bottom one here is a sculpin pattern that Travis paints up. These have been dynamite producers for me when the water's stained and you have some clouds and some sunshine. When the fish are deep or on dreary days when you don't have a lot of sunlight going on, and we get a lot of dreary days here in Eastern Washington in the fall and in the winter. This is when I, in my mind, like to go with green colors. Those green colors, if you remember the wavelength image here, green keeps its color. It's easily identifiable by a walleye into water of pretty deep depths. And if the water's clear, they can distinguish that green color in 50 feet of water or more. That green color in chartreuse also stands out pretty well on dreary days. So I like to have baits in that color scheme when I'm fishing deep. So let's look at some of the examples of colors and the environments that they were in as Travis and I have caught fish over the last couple of years with some of the designs that we have available. Travis caught some fish just the other day. He was out on Lake Roosevelt. He was fishing in about 25 feet of water. He was casting his blade baits on flats. It was a cloudy day, but there were some peaks of sun periodically through the day, so the light environment was probably changing. But the water was very clear, super clear. We haven't had much significant rainfall here recently into Lake Roosevelt, so the water is pretty darn clear. He had a pattern that he has made up in the last year called the COVID minnow. It has elements of chartreuse, dark blue, and white on it, and that was a good producer for him the other day. He also had good luck, and this is probably one of his most consistent baits. It's called the red sucker. It's got aspects of copper to it, gold, with a little bit of black overlay on it and a red belly. And he was doing very well with this, and I use this bait, and it's effective in a lot of environments. Here's a picture that I took last June. I was casting current seams in pretty stiff current, and the water was lightly stained at the time. It was a bright, sunny day. And this realistic pattern that had gold on it with scales, it's something that Travis painted up several years ago, and it was probably the best producer of the day. Caught probably a dozen fish on it, and some fish up to 4 or 5 pounds. On the same day, this was also a very good producer. Travis calls this one Dark Waters. It also has elements of gold in it, kind of a realistic pattern. It's got the purple back, similar to what you would see with a small rainbow trout or a kokanee. This is also the same day back in early June, and this is a bait that I really wanted to work badly that day, and I fished it quite a bit. Finally, towards the end of the day, I caught one fish on it, but this color pattern that was bright with orange and purple on it was not particularly productive that day. They were looking more for the realistic color patterns with the browns or the golds or the coppers. A couple weeks later, Travis and I went out to the same stretch of water. We were casting the current seams. We had a heck of a day, probably better than the day I had the week prior. We were in mid-June by this point. The water conditions hadn't changed a whole lot. It was a mostly sunny day, a few more clouds than what we had the time I went by myself, but Travis had very good luck with a craw pattern. He calls this one generic craw. This is a nice 4-pound fish that he caught and released, and this was also caught in a current seam. He worked this bait here too. One that he has that is quite similar is called Disco Frenzy Pop, and that one, instead of having the orange belly, has more of a chartreuse belly. But he caught a couple fish on this, as well as a couple of rainbow trout, I believe. But I'm really not sure that color made that much difference on this particular day, because pretty much whatever Travis and I threw out there on this mid-June day seemed to catch us some fish, and we caught some nice ones that day. Here's a nice image just to show that Travis doesn't always catch big fish like that last 4-pounder. Here's a probably 10-incher that he caught on Lake Roosevelt last April. This one was in about 30 feet of water. There was some moderate stain to the water. We were pushing some water through the system there, but in general, it wasn't too bad for early April. It was a mostly sunny day, and this was on a blank copper blade. This one throws a lot of flash, and this is a great producer on Lake Roosevelt, which is a clear water reservoir quite a bit of the year. I was fishing the same spot the October before, and this time I was catching fish in 50 feet on the tip of a point on a pretty steep drop, vertically jigging. And this was the Roosevelt Gold as well. I took the liberty to put some marks on there with a Sharpie. This particular copper blade was more productive than what my fishing partner was using that particular day. He was using some of the more traditional fire tigers and some other brighter chartreuse type colors. And so this one may go against my preconceived idea that greens and chartreuses in deep water are more effective, because on this particular day, this copper was money. Okay, we're back to the river, looking at jigging and current seams. This was early November, so the current seams are pretty weak at this particular time of the year. But in 35 feet, vertically jigging, I was able to get a couple walleyes on this sculpin pattern, again with clear water and in moderate depths. The realistic pattern was the ticket on this particular day. This is into December now. I was fishing 40 feet of water, vertically jigging on another river system. This river system, it's the Snake River, had a little bit more stain to it. It was a sunny day, but keep in mind, in December, your bright sun is not nearly as bright as it would be, say, in June or July. So in 40 feet of water, I was trying all kinds of different colors, and this color pattern ended up catching me several fish, and it was kind of a yellow or chartreusey color, and that ended up being a more productive pattern than the other patterns that I tried. And as far as rocks go, they don't seem to have a clear color preference, and I seem to catch rocks on no matter what I throw. So we'll bring this seminar to an end this evening. Hopefully we addressed some of the topics that we were hoping to talk about tonight. Just want to push those folks who live in North Idaho and Eastern Washington to check out the Spokane Walleye Club. We do a lot of fun things throughout the year, and we love fishing and we love talking about it. And one final plug for Fisherman's Foundry. Travis is a heck of a guy, good fishing partner, and he makes a very good product. Visit his website or the Facebook page and order yourself some blade baits and give them a try. So that's going to wrap it up for this presentation. Thank you for joining.